Welcome to Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and here with me is our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford. Hi, Larry. How are you?
Good day, Joy. Nice to be here.
Yes, it is a very nice day today. We are here to talk about Larry's article that he just came out last week with on Windmill Farm Fantasy. And Larry, can you tell us why this windmills are a fantasy?
Well, the fantasy is that the current administration and many world leaders think that by going to zero emissions, reducing carbon dioxide is going to save the planet from climate change, when in fact, there is no real scientific proof that this is going to happen, that there's been carbon dioxide in our atmosphere for hundreds of millions of years. And so it's really an ideological fantasy that by lowering carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel machines will save the planet from climate change. And again, as I have written in many instances, climate change, if the world warms up a little bit, might not be a bad thing, because it would increase farms in Canada and Russia as far as opening up the north. And more people die from cold than they do of the heat. So this whole concept of climate change being a bad thing is, well, maybe, but we don't have enough scientific proof to believe it. And then they have these computer models that are projecting things out 20 years or 50 years, and they can't even predict the weather a week from now accurately.
Right, exactly. And I have read what you're talking about, that further north could be more planting opportunities for farming, which opens up a good possibility. Hey, maybe Russia will stop fighting if they can start farming up there.
Precisely. And the concept of getting rid of fossil fuels that our current leadership seems hell-bent on is endangering American national security and economic security. Fossil fuels drive our power plants, they drive our transportation plants. They're responsible for the plastics that we use in our everyday living. They're responsible for the fertilizers that go into the food. This whole concept of getting rid of fossil fuels is a fantasy. We're not going to get rid of fossil fuels. And if we do get rid of fossil fuels, we do have nowhere near the infrastructure to power up electrical vehicles. And while we're talking about electrical vehicle, EV, the winner in the EV world is China. Why America wants to get rid of our combustion engine industry and transportation industry to help China out in electric vehicles is beyond my comprehension. Electric vehicles don't even show up on the scale of climate change. The amount of emissions from combustion engines is minuscule compared to coal. And who's the biggest polluter in the world? China. And China is building 2 coal plants a week, while the United States is building none. As a matter of fact, the United States is decommissioning coal power plants. So our total grid electricity sources are going down while China's are going up.
And we have talked about that before on previous podcasts.
Yes.
And you're absolutely right. And not to get ahead of ourselves, because I want to talk about this on another podcast as well on your BRICS that we talked about. But to my knowledge, China is still getting special treatment by the WTO, World Trade Organization, because they're a developing company or country.
Yes, it's
why
it's
is this still being allowed?
Again, there's so many things going on in this world that I just shake my head and say, I can't understand it. China is not a developing country. It should have no special preferences at all. And they're just consuming all this coal. And an EV vehicle has thousands of pounds more weight than the internal combustion engine vehicle, because batteries are heavy. And batteries to power electric vehicles, once they go, to replace them can cost you $15,000, $20,000 a year. So the so-called cost saving on electricity versus gasoline is a myth. And then, of course, we have the whole issue of infrastructure. The electricity grid is not geared up to power electric vehicles and electric households based on our current capacities and what we have down the road, the only way we're going to solve this problem is to really gear up nuclear energy and build nuclear power plants. Wind is a fantasy as being a source for power. Many a time, the wind doesn't blow. Germany has invested billions in wind power. And last year or the year before, for 30 days, there was no wind. And this was out on the ocean. They have a lot of the wind turbines out on the
Yes,
ocean.
I saw pictures of that.
And so and what did they have to do? They had to fire up their coal powered plants, which polluted the atmosphere even more. And they didn't have any electricity. Germany's electricity rates are 2 or 3 times higher than in America. It's causing their industries, and as you know, Germany is very heavily industrialized.
Right, and it's my understanding that they're shutting down their nuclear plants too, right?
Yes, and their coal power plants, they're shutting them down. So they're back in the bind. They're gearing up for some gas powered. Remember, America ended up shipping them a lot of liquid natural gas, but they're shutting down their nuclear power plants. I think the population is starting to turn, and you read articles where the population's turning, but the Green Party in Germany is a very powerful political force, and they're against nuclear. And so far they've been winning, but I'm not so sure if they keep on having cold winters and no electricity, and industries are having problems meeting world demand because the cost of electricity is so high.
Do you know why they're against nuclear, the Green Party?
I think they're just an environmentalist, that they say that the storage of nuclear waste is a hazard, and they're afraid of an explosion like it happened in Chernobyl 20 or 30 years ago. And we're now really getting off the subject of windmills, but nuclear energy is the safest of all. The United States Navy has been fueling nuclear subs since the 1950s. There's never been incident. There's never been a fatality from nuclear energy in the United States in history. There was a 3 Mile thing, but no one died from that.
No.
And the Chernobyl one was a total disaster, but that was a Russian or Soviet, those days, Soviet Union nuclear plant that had a dual purpose. It had a dual purpose of providing energy, but it was also a nuclear arms manufacturer of uranium. So it was a dual purpose nuclear plant. Terrible designs, terrible people. And as so happens in most disasters, it was on the midnight shift. So,
and we could also say that Russia, like China, is not going to care as much environmentally. They're just more for what's going to make them the money.
Precisely. And to build up the batteries in the EVs, China is exploiting child labor, slave labor in Africa and Indonesia. They're polluting the waters. They bring this ore from Africa and Indonesia back to China, so they pollute their own rivers and air, processing all these different minerals, which they sort of have a stranglehold on. So the United States doesn't have the minerals to make the electric batteries. There's a huge cry going on up in Michigan, where the governor's all in favor of sending $500 million to the Chinese to build a battery plant in Michigan, when Michigan, of course, is the home of fossil fuel vehicles. It's
why don't we build it here?
It's societal suicide. There aren't enough transmission lines to carry the windmills from the different places, and the windmills to hook into the grid. There aren't enough transmission lines, and to build them, you're corrupting the landscape. And in the case, for example, windmills are in the process of being built out on the ocean along the coast of New England, New York, and New Jersey. So while they're building these things and they're testing the waters, they're killing whales because they're doing all these sonic booms. They're disrupting the fishing grounds as they lay these foundations and lay these cables. And so it's a whale killer, fish killer. And of course, windmills are notoriously famous for killing birds. They kill hundreds and thousands of birds. I mean, one windmill company paid $8 million or something like that for 150 bald eagles it killed.
So I was aware of the birds, but in reading your paper, I really did not know that it was killing the whales and the fish like that.
Yeah,
so then I have to ask, if you're an environmentalist, shouldn't we be concerned about that as well?
Precisely. Plus, as I said, the cost of manufacturing and the intermittent. I mean, the wind does not always blow. So if the wind doesn't blow, don't tell me batteries are going to save us. There's no battery in the world right now that's big enough or efficient enough to store energy from windmills so that when the wind dies, the batteries will power society. It is absolute fantasy to think this is going to happen. I don't understand why people are willing to spend billions, trillions of dollars on windmills and solar when they're not proven ways, and there's nothing scientific about it that they can provide the electricity that a modern society needs. It's fantasy.
Now, I have to admit that years ago, I thought I saw the windmills in Germany and other things, and I thought, not a bad thought. Okay, maybe this could work as
Yeah.
an alternative energy source.
Yeah.
However, it also occurred to me, and Germany doesn't get what we get here in Florida, but what happens when hurricanes come? What happens?
That's an excellent point. The windmills don't work when there's no wind, but the windmills don't work when there's too much wind, and they automatically shut down because they're afraid of burning up. The windmills have gears, as you know, the windmill's turning around and around. Well, it's turning around inside a gearbox loaded with oil that once in a while catches fire. So they blow up because they catch fire because the gears get worn out or down. And then once in a while, the towers, they're building towers now that are going to have a total height with the blades included, 700 feet. That's a 70-story building. They crumble once in a while. So there's that whole issue. And then the so-called lifespan of a windmill is 20 years. Well, in reality, the average lifespan is somewhere around 12 years. And so you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars refurbishing the gears within the windmills, refurbishing the wires and transmissions. And we live right along the ocean here in Florida. Well, I grew up in New England. The ocean is corrosive as heck. And so all the gears, all the equipments are very, very hard to maintain without being corroded by salt air. And then if you want to dispose of the blades are made of composites that are very hard to recycle. And so they're going into landfills. So there's a whole nother issue of recycling old windmills and re-gearing them. It's a total fantasy that is good for the environment. It's just good
And I
for
would say
politicians.
it's not very aesthetically pleasing either.
Yeah. And it's like so many things in life. Follow the money. Those who are promoting windmills, those who are getting the money, think it's a terrific thing and they promote it, but it's all about the money.
Well, and then and part of the Green Deal and the whole infrastructure that this administration is pushing.
Yes, but it's
And
not just this. There's certainly a guilt, but the whole world is, at least Western world, I should say, is pushing this
Yes.
green energy thing. And it's certainly, even during the Trump administration, there were plenty of government agencies pushing for green energy. So, but I certainly blame the current administration for really making this an issue.
Well, with the subsidies, I guess starting new plants and different things and putting people back to work, as they're claiming, they could make money in different areas now in the green energy. I could see that, but I'm hearing, at least I heard on the news this morning, is that we don't have the manpower to build this infrastructure even.
No, we don't have the skilled labor. Yeah. And for every job that the green energy is generating, just remember the local gas stations, all the industries associated with the existing transportation industry, the automobile industry, the energy industry is going to lose jobs more in the millions. And so the green energy subsidies of jobs is just another boondoggle for government expenditures and people who have a tie to the government gravy train. If electric vehicles were so great and the population really thought they were worthwhile, why are we spending billions of dollars subsidizing people to buy them? Doesn't make sense to me.
Why is Elon Musk reducing the price?
Yeah, because he knows the government's going to bail them out. The government's bailing out all these windmills and solar energy places. The government's bailing them out because it's the interest of lobbyists and high-priced lawyers and people who are making a buck off the green energy.
Although I will say this, my dad has a Prius and it gets like 50 miles to the gallon and I only paid $15 to fuel it up. So that is kind of nice, but that's hybrid. It's not all reliant on just the electric vehicle.
Yeah.
And that being said, going back to what you were saying before, he has to replace that battery every so many years.
Yeah. And then and of course, he was subsidized, I'm sure, with some sort of tax credit and reduced price from the government. So it's a fantasy, a dangerous fantasy, an expensive fantasy, and it's exploiting China to the detriment of the United States.
Yeah, because we certainly are a big, well, probably the biggest supplier of oil and gas, and
Yeah.
certainly have plenty of resources here. So
Yeah, we're having all these resources and we're throwing them away to buy technology from China. Okay,
and
that makes
stopping
sense.
what we have already here,
Yeah.
just to go on this agenda with the Green Deal and
Yeah.
as you said, the windmills and the solar. Now, that being said, could we use solar and, in your opinion, could we use solar and windmills to be an alternative energy to?
I think supplemental would be a better word. I mean, I have no problem with solar in houses, for example. That sort of makes sense.
Mhm.
But to have solar farms or windmill farms, especially windmills, I mean, they're a disaster for the environment. Just looking at them, they might look pretty, but not if you live near them. If you're a neighbor, they're starting to have a lot of pushback in the heartland of America. Those darn things keep on humming and humming and humming while they're running anyways. They're 24/7. So now people who live there, their quality of life is diminished. And I just read an article recently where they also install airplane red lights on top of these 3 or 4 or 5, 600-foot monstrosities for airplanes. And
Yeah,
so
they would
now
have
if you're living at a home, all you see is a red light, blinking red light in your window at night.
Mhm.
It's not conducive to humans, and they're certainly not conducive to birds, that's for sure.
Mhm. And going back to, so now back a couple of years ago, again, when I was thinking the windmills, maybe that's not a bad idea. Solar, I agree with on the houses might make sense as a supplemental, as you're saying, that's good. I wrote a paper on some of this because I was looking into the environmental changes, and like you said, we don't know how long we're in certain changes of weather patterns, but we were talking about the emissions, the CO2 emissions. And I had read that actually, in talking about Russia up in the north now having more capability possibly for farmland due to the warming,
Yeah.
they also have peat moss, which I was reading absorbs the CO2 emissions. So there seems to be a natural occurring cycle.
Well, like everything else in life, Joy, there's another side to it. As the northern climates get warmer, Russia in particular, there's these gases
Yes.
buried in the ice. And so as the ice is melting, methane is escaping into the atmosphere. So that's a real
That's
downside.
another problem too.
That's another big
I
problem.
mean, okay, methane, we could probably argue also, we have a lot of cows.
Yeah.
So that's coming
Yeah.
from there. So I don't think we can blame people entirely on this.
Precisely. And as I've mentioned before, I grew up in New England, and 20,000 years ago, New England was buried under 5,000 feet of ice. Humans did not cause that 5,000 feet of ice to melt. It was the sun, and who else knows.
Well, I am a believer in the cycles, and we don't know how long this cycle will last or not, but
Right.
I do think it will.
Yes.
And not to take it lightly, because we certainly should mitigate for the global warming. And as we can see down here in South Florida, we have a lot of inland flooding, more so than we have had in the past. So
That's
definitely
correct.
should need to mitigate for things that can possibly happen.
Yes. I'm not so sure getting rid of fossil fuels is the answer.
No, probably not.
Yeah.
Not being dependent on that, especially like I said, if a hurricane comes along, which is very common these days down here,
Yeah.
what is going to happen to those windmills
Yeah.
and the cost to replace them
Yeah.
and our energy if we're dependent upon that and solar?
I hope we're not dependent on solar and windmills for the future.
I hope not either.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Larry. Appreciate you coming on and talking about your latest article. Actually, it's not your latest article. We will be talking about your latest article next week. So please stay tuned for more Peace Through Strength podcast.
Thank you, Joy. I enjoyed it as always. Take care.
And
Bye-bye.
to our listeners, you can find Larry's articles on our website at www.ascf.us. He's also now on Substack, so please check that out. And subscribe to our newsletter on our website, and you will receive all the updates on his articles and our podcasts, as well as follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Rumble channel. Thank you again, Larry.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you to our listeners, and join us again next time for Peace Through Strength podcast.